Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Shambhavi. I'm a strategist at Gender at Work India. And this is Circle Back, our monthly conversation series where we unpack institutions and how they shape individuals and work cultures. Last time we spoke about belongingness and what it means to belong at the workplace with Zahara Fernandez of Accenture. That discussion is up on our YouTube and on our Linktree as well if you'd like to check it out. The focus of today's conversation will be on disability and reasonable accommodation, a very important conversation which we don't get to hear that much of. And we're so happy to be joined by Shivangi Agrawal. Shivangi is a queer and disabled activist based in Delhi. They are currently working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion team at Thoughtworks and are also a member and consultant at the Youth Coalition for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. They have over 6 years of experience working as a consultant, researcher, writer, advisor, and facilitator, with an emphasis on advocacy for disability, sexuality, gender, policy, so on and so forth. There's a lot that Shivangi does, so we're so glad to be joined by you. Welcome, Shivangi. We also have Sudarsana Kundu. Sudarshana is the managing trustee of Gender at Work India. She is passionate about supporting institutions, both within the private and public sector, to drive a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. Over the last 2 decades, she has advised several organizations, including several UN agencies, to evaluate and assess the impact of their workplace policies, practices, and culture on gender equality. Thank you to you both for joining us. I would also like to quickly spotlight our Indian Sign Language interpreters, Saurav and Preeti, who will be interpreting the session as we go along. And to make their work easier, I'm just requesting everyone to ensure a conversational pace while speaking so that the interpreters can catch up. I also request the speakers to take turns while speaking. And when we open for the round of question and answers, I request the audience members to mention their name or type their name out in the chat box. And during the conversation, please keep your mics on mute. So that's all in terms of, simple housekeeping to make sure that this is, an inclusive and clear conversation. And before we start, as always, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge our privilege and just open this question to both our speakers today. We all come from different, journeys and experiences. So just as people who are having these conversations and who are looking to understand ways to enable inclusion and enable diversity and representation at multiple levels, just a moment to acknowledge that this space also has value and also has, a lot of importance and how we can make the best of it. And with that, I would hand this over to you, Sudarshana.
Thanks so much, Shambhavi. Thanks again to Saurav and Preeti for joining us today. And Shivangi, it's such a pleasure to have you today with us. In a way, welcome back to Gender at Work. We've loved having conversations earlier with you, but we want to share that conversation with everyone else as well. I want to start us off with sort of a bigger question. I've been now working on diversity and inclusion for many years. And when we started off, and the sense that I get is that the conversation or the discourse around people with disabilities is really at the periphery. But given your own experience of having joined, the private sector or having joined and worked with several different organizations, what was your initial experience? So we'd love to hear from your own experience of, what was it for a queer disabled person to join an institution? And what was the discourse around? Has that shifted over the last, 6 years that you've been working? And what has shifted and what has not shifted? So if you could just start off with that.
Yeah. Thank you for having me and for that introduction, Shambhavi and Sudarshana. So I think I'll start a little bit about myself. That for me, I was born with physical disability, And then I also acquired, mental illness over the year. And growing up with a disability was not easy for me. I faced a lot of difficulties, etc. But with queerness, there was, something that was something that was a very beautiful journey. When I realized that, it was something that I identified with. And I think it was in college, when I became very active with LGBTQ student collectives, and actively exploring queerness by being part of, events and pride marches. And I think for me, what I've realized over the years is that queerness and disability are very interconnected. And in my work, I've realized that you will not hear a lot about the history of disability or queer rights movement in South Asia, especially, disability rights movements and history of how things, how laws came about and how accessibility, whatever we do have, came about. And so when our history is like erased, we find that, like, so a lot of times in disability circles, we are still stuck in, the definitions and like basic terminology. So for example, like the current, Indian government has termed people with disabilities as Divyang, uh, which literally means the divine body. So this shows that we are still stuck in that medical and charity model of disability, completely going against the UN conventions for rights for persons with disabilities. Those of you who know a little bit of history on how the UN conventions for rights for persons with disabilities came about, it was an amazing group of people with disabilities from around the world that came together for the first time. And this included people from many different types of disabilities, not just physical disabilities. But something that was very big highlight was that a lot of people from invisible disabilities, mental illnesses were part of writing this document, the UN Conventions for Rights for Persons with Disabilities. And it's a very powerful document, which really needs to be something that a lot of us, adopt in our workplaces, which I don't see. That's something that I feel is lacking. The UN Convention is not used in a lot of places. And I think in India, obviously, we try to rely more on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act, which is based off of the UN conventions and the fact that India is a signatory of that UN convention. But I think there is a lot of difficulties in implementation with that document, with the Indian RPD Act, and the fact that it limits, I think 21 or 20, I can't remember the number, but yeah, 21 disabilities.
Wow.
Yeah, 21 disabilities. Thank you. Um, it limits the act for those 21 disabilities, and we know there are so many more. And it goes against, again, the UN conventions, I think. And I think it's the same with the recent Trans Act of 2019 in India, which really medicalizes the bodies, again,
Right.
like the medical model, and
Right.
identities even more further. So because of these things, because of the erasure of history and understanding of where, you know, like what were the movements that occurred to create those documents and those policies, there is a lot of isolation and loneliness because our identities are often not even acknowledged. And I work a lot with youth also, and we see that, a lot of them, disabled and queer and trans youth, are not even safe in their own homes with their biological families, who don't even understand us. Like most of the people with disabilities in India often face like a big challenge of, the caregivers, the
Right.
biological families who do not let us move around freely, often confining us to like one room of the house where no one will notice us.
Right.
And this mainly happens because there is a lot of shame. Society is ashamed to be associated with us and wants to invisibilize us. They're not okay with being uncomfortable. And so I think as disabled and queer folks, we're constantly fighting for that right for self-determination and basic right to be recognized as equal citizens, of society. So self-determination is a concept, it kind of gives us the right to identify ourselves the way we want to be, rather than, the professionals telling us what is our diagnosis is, or the doctors, giving us a disability certificate, or, the caregivers telling us, oh, like, this is what your life should be. So I think, I think, like, for me at least, and I'm sure for you all as well, you know yourself better than any doctor or counselor or family member or anyone, I think. So
Right.
that is the whole concept of self-determination, which is very important. And I think another issue that we face, often as queer and disabled sorry, people are often that as we are seen as like a source of information and inspiration. So without being offered any meaningful support, we are just constantly seen as an inspiration, as information, as a source of information. A lot of organizations, they don't see us as collaborators. They don't reciprocate our efforts. A lot of times, the contributions that we make in society, they just say that, oh, this person, their work is inspiring, but it's not reciprocity. You're not really responding, or you're not working with us. So I think we're really tired of being seen as that inspiration porn. Inspiration porn is again a term used in the disability. A lot of young people with disabilities are using it, saying that it's like we are a lot of people with disabilities. There are videos about us, there are reels about us, and it's like we're just seen as a inspiration porn. Oh, we've achieved this and that. We've traveled here and there, and it involves really in exploiting our personal narratives for inspiration, or marketing tools, and it's a reduction of our experience to like just mere anecdotes, and which undermines our agency and fails to acknowledge the complex realities that we navigate daily. So those are, some things that I felt. And I think to create that meaningful disability and LGBTQ inclusion strategy, it is very, very essential to include, not just include, but ensure that people with lived experience are made a part of the shaping policies and practices that affect our lives. Like what the UNCRPD was all about, because there is that very popular term that originated from South African disability movements, nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something which is used around the world, and it is very essential for that, inclusion and, understanding marginalized identities. Yeah.
This so many lovely thoughts there, Shivangi, and that's so many great insights. I mean, one of the things that you brought up was the fact that even within the right to persons with disabilities, which came about in 2016, so quite late in itself, first it went from 7 to 21. 7 was the previous one, and then 21, which is still fairly limiting and still doesn't cover. And that erasure itself starts from that regulatory framework, right? And even the data that we have around rights of people with this, people with disabilities, the data is kind of, the statistics are underwhelming because you haven't really captured correctly all the people with disabilities in India. So that's in terms of, so this thing that you kind of talked about, erasure starts from there, erasure in terms of thinking about what's happening within your families, within the organization, invisibilization and shaming that kind of comes in. Those are things that we all need to kind of think about and reflect on. And this other thing that you shared, which was again so insightful, which is about this ponds of inspiration ponds, right? About people with disabilities being treated as that. Um, but if you have to now think about working with organizations, right? You know, the life of a person with disabilities itself is difficult, right? Because you've already you're struck, you know, you've kind of had to kind of define or make way within your home, in school, in college, or wherever you are. Now you've kind of arrived at an organization. What do you think? What have you seen, and what do you think should be some of the essential components of a holistic policy towards disabled people within these organizations?
Yeah. I think I want to like start addressing this, question on policy about with like this term which we sometimes hear about a lot and sometimes we don't, especially in corporate world, we don't hear a lot about it. It's called intersectionality. I think one of the things very important in any kind of work is intersectionality. It's a term which I think Nitya and like a lot of other folks who have raised hands know what it means. It is basically it was a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, to really understand the systemic oppression of being a Black woman, which are two aspects of identity to create a unique type of experience like race and gender. So, for example, for me, my experiences cannot just be understood as a disabled person. Which is very, something a visible part of my identity. But you have to also consider my experience as a queer person. And this is something, that plays a huge role in the workplace. Like, let me share some examples. I think some that we've heard of, very common. Like in the US, there have been many studies on, the wage gap between men and women. There is a wage gap where women are paid much lesser. But there are also studies that show a much larger wage gap between white women who get paid much more than Black women. So if we think about our workplaces while doing, women-specific hiring drives and recruitment programs or policy writing, how many companies I feel, consider, trans women, or when celebrating March as Women's History Month or International Women's Day, how many organizations consider having Dalit women as speaker? Those are things that really need to be integrated into diversity and inclusion programs, because if you're not doing intersectional work, then you have to do a bottom up approach. That is the whole idea. I think that is the whole point of diversity and inclusion, that we are unfortunately, we won't be truly inclusive if we are not considering intersectionality. So I think, like, for example, like if we are only working for, the top layer, the cishet women, upper caste women, we are only covering a very small gap between the glass ceiling. So, if you imagine, like it's a very small gap if you're only, addressing policies and etc. for just uh, a specific group. You're not looking at the bottom up approach. What are the people at the bottom facing? What are people with intersectionality facing? And so a lot of people who are living with in those intersections, the glass ceiling is still very, 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 very far away. And I think that's something that policies really need to consider. For example, like what I want to, it's not just the disability policy, it has to be integrated into like the parental policy, for example. Parental policy, when you're creating that, you shouldn't just be looking at like the mother, the stereotypical, um, uh, cisgender woman who is giving birth. You have to really look at intersectionality of where that woman is coming from. Like if you're not giving access to, for example, trans men to be able to access that policy, or and still be identified as who they are, then that policy is not inclusive. And same with disability policy. If you're creating a ramp in one of your buildings, but that building is still not accessible to someone who is from a lower socioeconomic status, where there is a lot of security checks, gendered security checks, where there is ID, like you have to show your ID, etc. To even enter the building, then the ramp is of no use, because you're not looking at the intersectional experience of someone who might be, coming from other like disability and trans and disability, or things, like similar to that. So I hope that gives a little bit of understanding how to think about policies. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Shivangi. And we'll come back to this a little bit and dig deeper. But one of the things that we've been hearing a lot, or it's becoming people are acknowledging, or but may not fully understand it, is this concept of reasonable accommodation within workplaces, right? So how do we understand this concept and reasonable accommodation? And have you seen this? Are there good practices that that other organizations could be encouraged to adopt when you apply concept of reasonable accommodation?
Yeah, I think definitely it's a required concept, and there are like companies that are having reasonable accommodation policies, but again, like if it is not comprehensive, then the HR or the people team, they struggle with implementing those. They have a policy, they have everything, all the um, uh, ideas in place, but the implementation is a big struggle. So I think,
yeah, so for our audience, maybe if you could clarify what reasonable accommodation means,
yeah.
And then maybe we can take it from there.
Yeah, so reasonable accommodation is basically any kind of access need that an individual with disabilities might require to be able to work in an equitable way with their colleagues. So it could be, for example, we have sign language interpreters here. That is a reasonable accommodation. Then for like we have one of the best reasonable accommodation is like having closed caption, which a lot of the online virtual meetings have these days. Reasonable accommodations are a little different from accessibility, like full on accessibility. It's like where the employee and the organization, they come to an understanding, if so that it's not a huge cost to that company, or that it takes a long time, but it's something that like for example, working from home is a reasonable accommodation that a lot of organizations have started giving now for people with disabilities. And it, like I said earlier, you have to think of the intersectional approach, where you are not just thinking of disabilities, the 21 disabilities that are there in the Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act. You're really thinking of other identities and other concerns that a lot of people come with. For example, someone it will be like reasonable accommodation. The whole idea is like universal design is another concept which is very important to understand. Um, if you're thinking of accessibility and reasonable accommodation, you really have to think of universal design and how that access point will help someone from other identities as well. Because like, for example, even there has been a lot of, history of creating like text messaging, right? Like text messaging was something that it was invented by deaf persons. So I can't remember the name of that. My memory is bad with names and dates and all. But if we didn't have someone making an accommodation or an access need for texting, then we wouldn't have had maybe text messaging in the same way that we have now. And so I think now it's a universal thing where everyone uses it, even a lot of people who don't have any, sort of historically marginalized identity. Sometimes they say, I prefer texting over calls or stuff like that. So I think though that is the whole idea of, I think, reasonable accommodation. A lot of times you shouldn't be specifying it to an individual. You should really be thinking of it as a universal design and community. What is the community that will be impacted by it?
You had started talking, Shivangi, about the challenges in implementation of this concept of reasonable accommodation. Could you give some examples around what you mean by that? Like, where do companies, where do organizations really fail in the implementation of reasonable accommodation?
Yeah, so I think, for example, if uh, if someone is, you have a person with disabilities, and especially with someone who has mental illnesses like and neurodivergence, they might request like when they're traveling, they might request like a caregiver travels with them. Though that is something that a lot of times, when someone requests it, the HR or the whichever team, relevant teams, are unable to kind of understand and process why this person is requesting this when they can work independently. And so that implementation of like when the person requests it, and then why they're doing it, what is the reason, the questions, I think the societal questions that come into play, not that makes implementation difficult. And I think communication between different teams, that is required, that this person needs this kind of accommodation, those are difficult things. And we see that in the government also, where they'll say that we want to create accessible cities, we want to create buses that are accessible. They've created buses with the ramp that comes out in Delhi, but is it really being implemented? Is it, where buses don't even stop for a minute enough to take out the ramp? You're implementing in a way, you're thinking that you're implementing, but then that true integration is not there, and usability is not there. Even in buses, if you have accessibility, but is the bus stop accessible? Is the person able to easily get from their home to the bus stop? Those are like smaller parts which people don't think about. They think about a bigger thing like a ramp or an accessible building, accessible toilet, and accessible bus, but they don't think about the smaller things. Then that becomes a big challenge. I think it shows in organizations also, where the smaller things are not understood. Yeah.
And whereas and as having this discussion today with another not-for-profit, whereas sort of in the for-profit, the corporate sector, this accessibility issue has been taken up. They can afford it as well, right? You can now have ramps, you have elevators, people are also thinking about, even in terms of how do you kind of make sure your IT systems, your computers, all of that are kind of geared towards. But when we think about a nonprofit sector which works for the issues of social change, which is so under-resourced as is, the issue of accessibility becomes really difficult because, I mean, think about where all these offices are located. Most of these offices are located in places where people with physical disabilities won't be able to just go there, meet people. It's so kind of difficult. Even in these places, in the centers that are run by or meant for people with disabilities, those centers itself are so inaccessible. One of the things that when we started off with another sort of an organization that I work closely with, Kornaidisha, we were doing these audits of centers which were working with people with intellectual disabilities. And in most of these, there is no way to kind of get wheelchair access or people with any kind of other support. And all of these that you kind of mentioned, which requires in terms of special assistance, those were all kind of absent for people with disabilities. So that's something for sure. But one of the other points that you kind of mentioned, Shivangi, is this: you might have all these systems in place, but if it's people's attitudes don't change, right? I mean, this is the thing in terms of the three A's, right? About of having accessibility, affordability, and then attitudes, right? And this attitude bit is the big one. How do you change attitudes of people? What are some of the things that you are doing in these various organizations and campaigns that you're connected with? What are some of the promising practices, approaches, and what should we all be doing more of when we kind of think about changing attitudes of people?
I think that is something that a lot of organizations, they approach with, like sensitization and awareness sessions. Obviously, those are extremely important, where you are giving an integrated workshop on to the employees on what is how to be an ally or how to support um, uh, uh, someone with a disability. What are the disability etiquettes that are involved when you're working with someone with disabilities. But I think it's a bigger strategy and an approach that organizations require, where, like I said earlier, the very important part is where you're bringing people from different experiences forward, like uh, kind of bringing them into the decision making body, so that they are able to uh, uh, kind of shape those um, ideas and challenge those ideas. And uh, I think, like, a lot of organizations, they give importance to, like, especially in corporates, there is this uh, ERGs, which are there, employee resource groups, um, where people, they make a collective and they come together to kind of uh, uh, shape those ideas, challenge those ideas, write about them, and also obviously welcome allies as well. I think very important thing in organizations and workplaces is that allyship is created, uh, and how to be an ally, challenge discrimination, and really making it a priority. Rather than something that is on the back seat. I think those are some of the most important ways in which you need to understand that people come from different experiences. And I think one of the things that we also see nowadays a lot is like mental health, and that there is a very clear interrelation between having a marginalized body to our mind. So because of the way that we experience life, how we look, or how we are perceived from our disabilities, gender, sexuality, caste. We are often, we face bullying, we face exclusion, and lack of understanding of our needs, lack of accessibility and reasonable accommodations. And then that means that there are no safe spaces for us. So I think a lot of times, like having it in the education system itself, early education needs to have, uh, these kind of sensitization sessions, and healthcare professionals should have them. Every profession where a doctor should be having these sessions. They should not just be having these sessions, but these strategies and these collectives. Even something like finding a house, like people who are leasing houses and stuff like that. That is also where a lot of people struggle. People with disabilities can't find housing. So I think it starts from those, those things where we are really questioning every kind of profession and space to bring in that uh, sensitivity and allyship, which is very important, I think. And I think like in private, like in a lot of uh, um, like in private companies, there is sometimes a lot of focus on like we're gonna invite someone from this experience and like have them share their journey. But we have to understand the distinction between that, again, that inspiration bond, where you're really putting that person like on a stage, like an icon or something. But and then the difference between like working with them, like reciprocity and collaboration. I think those are very, very important, because hardly anyone works together. I remember one time I was, approached by someone who was very interested in having an independent living facility for people with autism. And I asked them a very like basic question in the beginning: do you have any people with autism in your team? And they were very surprised, and they were like, but how do we don't even know, like how can we have someone who's with autism in our teams? And these are people who work with people, people with autism for years and years and years, and even they don't think that that person will be capable of being part of that decision making table. So like that is the most basic part where we need to question that attitude of are we really including people in the decision making table, where you know uh, where where it's important. So yeah, you know, I hope that answers the question a little bit. You're on mute, I think.
One of the things that you reiterated, Shivangi, is this concept of inclusion, right? And this inclusion, and you talked of early education. And a lot of our education is so segregated. You have special ed schools, special needs schools, centers, therapists, but there isn't really inclusion. And many of us have, gone through an entire education system without really being exposed to people from who have different needs as compared to us. So when we enter an organization and we are asked to kind of take decisions, or we take decisions, one, as you said, we don't include people in those decision making roles, and we don't even have the requisite knowledge or exposure to be able to make those decisions ourselves, right? So because we've never had that. So that early education bit that you talked of, and having that inclusion in every sector, not only in the organization but in education, healthcare, and at every different levels, right? Not only as a student but also as a teacher, as a healthcare provider, to make sure that you're actually doing that at every kind of that reciprocity is always maintained. It's not just one way that you're going to give, and but you need to also receive, right? So that kind of reciprocity needs to happen in every sector and in every organization. So that's something that's really something that we can think about. And one of the things that, I was reminded was also is is how for to make an entire organization, we've talked about this, right? We kind of that uh, it's not just enough for that one person, right? You talked of the universal. So one of the things that I like, for example, Lemon Tree, which works with people with autism and also with people with hearing impairment. Everyone in the team actually has learned sign language because it's not enough for those few people to know sign language, but everyone on their operational team, front desk, back end, knows to use sign languages. So you have to actually really be so involved and kind of get to that level for it to actually start being meaningful, for your policy to be actually operational. So that's actually great. And we would maybe start taking questions, and we can come back to some more questions again. But maybe the audience, we would have some questions to ask you, Shivangi.
Please, we're open for questions and feel free.
Or would anyone want to share their own experiences? That would also be interesting because we really want this to be a conversation space. Uh, yeah, Shivam.
Yeah,
Yes.
everyone, I have a conversation with the people like you, especially the Shivangi. She speaks so much about everything in depth. Every time I had a conversation with her, it's every topics. It gives me an immense pleasure and a knowledgeable perspective to each and everything for the person with disability. And I want to congratulate her for that. And my basic question is that I was working with a school which was had each and every disabled people employed in that, and that was a special school. But they are now closing that school just because the founder was died. So I don't understand that, like, my basic accommodations to these peoples and the children's, the basic needs of them children has been going to be finished, and they are not going to get any people because all the children's and everybody is belongs to SC and ST category. They are not belongs to the general category, and they have no financial resources and any kind of resources. So the question of reasonable accommodation in education system is vanished in my whole state, and nobody provides them. So how can I make, because I am planning to have opening an organization which will work for that, and I still for the funding resources I have no resources, so which I can help them with the requirement of them, so they can get a basic education at the elementary level, because elementary education and the primary education is not available to person with disabilities in remote areas in India. This is the harsh reality, and especially when it comes to women with disability, and they are subject to harassments in their own family, as Shivangi talked about, and everybody. So I want to overcome that problem, but I have no resources except the financial resources which I have accumulated on my own. That was my question to the whole panel. Because
Yeah,
unless you don't have knowledge about anything, you cannot come and talk to the person, because you need to understand the psychology of that person, what they are thinking and what they are talking. And because they are very hesitant to talk about it, and I am not being able to sometimes understand their so how to start a conversation with them and how to make them comfortable so I can solve their problem. Because people come to me and ask for the basic government scheme which allow them to give them the basic pension schemes, which is for them, and they are not been able even to get a disability certificate, UDID certificates in the
sure,
district government hospitals,
sure,
which will give them a basic connotation to get their certified that they are disabled.
sure. Shivam, where are you based?
I am based in remote village in nearby Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh. It is the capital city of Madhya Pradesh.
Sure. No, thanks. Shivangi, did you want to respond to that? And then maybe I can add as well.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of things there. What you said about the school who has lost, their leadership uh, and is not able to function. It's very important to find that, that next generation of leadership. And I think I feel like it's difficult to give like clear solutions, to very complex problems. Like you said, intersectionality was very important in that aspect, where a lot of those disabled children come from SC/ST backgrounds, and their education is going to be taken away. And I think that's a big concern, where um, a lot of children with disabilities are unable, like they don't have equal access to education. They're not given equal access to opportunities. Their you know the right to education is very much like the backseat that for a lot of government policies. I think questioning, and really looking at like going to the government buildings. I know it's a big struggle to even interact with them, but going to the MLAs, going to the local panchayat or whoever, and questioning them, what are they doing with their resources, what are they doing with the what is their thoughts on kind of what they would want to do for someone from for children with disabilities, what kind of provisions they want to provide, and what kind of education is being given. If this school is closing down, can they find another school for them? Can they find another space for them? Can they find a different leadership, someone else who can, um, be the head of that school? And so I think it's very important, I think, to hold the government accountable, especially in smaller towns and cities, I think. And I think another thing was about, I think, the disability certificates, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I mean that's a big struggle even for me, getting a disability certification. And I have some amount of privilege. My caste privilege is there. My class privilege, is there. And even I struggled a lot with getting my disability certificate or my UDID, where I was, mistreated by the doctors. They don't understand. They want to see the body in pieces. And one of the most difficult thing is that uh, they they don't talk to you directly. The doctors, they don't want to talk to you directly. And it's evident in every single disability. Even like when I was there one day, this is a big hospital in Delhi. I was there one day, and uh, there was a person, a little older, like middle-aged person, who was deaf. There were a couple of them who were there, and they were not even able to talk. Like they didn't even know sign language, let alone sign language. They wouldn't even maybe write it down. They wouldn't do anything to try to communicate. They just kept talking, and it was just so ridiculous to see something like that in this day and age, where the disability, it's so every government hospital in Delhi has, and I think in all over India, has a disability certificate assigning body room, a bunch of people who work in that disability room, or whatever you call it, disability in that hospital. So they don't even know sign language. They are not even communicating directly with the person with disability. Every time you go, they will ask you, "Oh, why didn't you bring someone with you?" why you should bring someone with you who we can talk to directly. But so they don't even see us, so that is a big issue that a lot of people us face trying to get disability accommodations. Because that process of getting disability certificate is a big struggle. And you see in other countries, they don't require any certification. Then they don't require any disability certificate to be given to be able to give any kind of accommodation or any kind of admission in college, etc. Only in India you'll see that there is like this specific disability certificate with a certain percentage. Only a certain percentage of disability will get this allowance and that allowance. So I a lot of times even question those, even though I'm part of those structures where I am getting a disability certificate, I am submitting it when I'm, trying to get an accessible, when I'm trying to get a reasonable accommodation. But it's very important to even question, why, like when earlier I was talking about self-determination, why that self-determination is not enough for us to ask for accommodations. If someone, for example, is temporarily disabled, or for example, someone is, like comes from an intersectional identity. For example, I'll use like colleges and universities, like especially private colleges where a lot of people from SC, ST, like you said, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi backgrounds require more time to submit their work, maybe because they haven't had the same privilege and access to information as the so-called peers who have had access, where their parents can support them. So that is an reasonable accommodation that you're giving to someone, but they're not going to be able to present a disability certificate to ask for that extra time, right? So I think that is I hope that understanding is very important, that it's not, disability is not something you constantly see. It's a disability justice is a is a is kind of challenging systemic things that make things like make a lot of things a barrier for us overall. So yeah, I hope that made sense. Sorry if it was jumbled.
No, thanks so much, Shivangi. One of the things that you also raised about government accountability, we haven't really talked about that much. But there was recently a Supreme Court directive to states, because most states have not framed rules, have not also kind of assigned a disability commissioner in each of their states, right? So, and that's as recent as July. And so I think there are more than half the states which have not even formed rules as per the central, the Act 2016 Act. So we're really lagging behind in terms of state accountability. There are no resources. Getting the UDID is so difficult. All of those public hospitals, as you talked of it, and kind of making this piecemeal thing about one leg, one arm, one eye, accounting for this much disability. It's an accounting problem almost, in terms of getting to and saying that, here's a person who has disability, has 10% disability, has 20% disability, should be partial, should be whatever, right? In terms of doing all of that. That's that fragmentation of the body that you talked of is so astounding. Yeah. So yeah, so maybe, and the other thing that I wanted to kind of also maybe add to it is that we also need to possibly do donor education. On one hand, we have the public accountability, but there is also donors who need to put in more investment into this sector. It's a really under-resourced area. People do not recognize the issue as important, and so we need to kind of also amplify our voices there. So that's the other thing that I want to mention. Deepali, you've got your hand up for a while, so we come to you. If you can, if Shambhavi, if you can unmute yourself, and then. And Jasmine, if you can leave your question right now on the chat, we might be able to respond to it right away. So, yeah.
Dipali, you can go ahead. I think you can unmute here.
Yeah. So thank you, Shivangi. Shivangi bringing this lots of insights and some experiences which somewhere again giving kind of that thought ki how much work we need to do with the system and society. So I'm just bringing one more experience. We're working with the gender-based violence survivor, those who left their houses and coming on the street and living as a homeless. So we've seen the some of the young women, those who are leave their houses, yeah, they're forced to leave because they're having the disabilities, and there's a family look them as a burden where they couldn't continue support to them and to feed them, and that's why they forced to them to move out from the families. And when see when these young women coming, the most of the marginalized SCST and the Dalit Bahujans women, those illiteracy level is a very less, there is a less skills, and in that situations when we are facilitating safe spaces to them, it's a situation in a Mumbai city. We can imagine what's the state and the situation in across the country. The shelter homes and the safe spaces is not somewhere infrastructure in design that lens where the people coming with the physical disabilities and even the with some mental health issues also. We also seeing when they living with these shelter homes, there is a no rehabilitation plan having a government, even to that is government state owned, and even the NGOs, because there is a no sectors outside sector design their workspaces that way. Yeah, there are machine, there's a product, there's an environment that way where this population can get a work opportunities. And that's we seeing in the most of times when they're not getting any opportunity for working, they somewhere then they started to move in a sex work, a flesh industry. And that's also we can say is a force because that's a livelihoods are not taken care by government and the society. And that's a completely and again, as you mentioned in your experience key, to get a certificate is it's a challenge for these people coming from even those who are a privileged background. And we seen there's a these young girls, those who are coming from the underprivileged background, marginalized, and once they left their house, they did not carry any identity document. So when you don't have any identity document, you cannot get your, which is a very much important certificate to entitle to get an entitlement in this country, even the subsidy and the other certificate. And there's a other political scenario because most of times when these young women coming across the country to these mega cities, that the politically the people is not allowing to allow them to get any kind of the benefit to their state, and that's they were pressuring to send back to these people to their state. So these kind of the politics dynamics and conflict also impacting on these young populations working opportunity. So we really facing difficulties to in rehabilitate to young youth populations coming with these challenges because there is a no around support system, either the state, either the government, and either to societies.
Thanks, Shivangi. Do you want to just respond to it? And for others, I know we're almost running close to the end of this. So if you can put your question in the chat box, or you could just email us, and we will try and respond to you. And keep this conversation going. Actually, even on our social media, if you want to kind of raise some questions, we'd be more than happy to kind of coordinate with Shivangi and others and to respond to these questions. So we love these questions coming. So keep them going. Shivangi, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, Dipali, I think I was really amazed, by raising, like you're raising really important questions on the basic, provisions that the government provides and why they're doing things in a certain way. I think that is one of the first step, I think, where you're really questioning those basic things and why there is a process for this and that, and why things are done in this way, and things, sometimes people think that it is pointless to question, and pointless to overthink about the provisions that are there. But I think that is where a lot of thought process starts, where when if you're not questioning, if you're not thinking about why the process is this way, then you struggle to even bring any change, or you struggle to address those things, I think. So I am really amazed, and like not amazed, I should say, but like it's commendable that you are questioning those things, especially for something as difficult to work with, gender-based violence in India. It's in smaller towns, it's a big struggle to domestic violence. It's something that like hardly anyone addresses and talks about, and it's something that a lot of us go through. Even Shivam earlier, I think, was talking about how women with disabilities are facing not having a safe space in their own homes. I mean, we are talking here about workplaces, but our homes itself are not accessible. They are not safe. They are not, and I think even with like LGBTQ rights, you see that where the Section 377 was read down because of the Right to Privacy Act, and therefore it means that if you're queer or if you're LGBTQ plus, then it should be a private matter. It should be something private. But privacy is not how, like private. I don't think anything is private. Like a lot of people say, everything is political. All of these things are political. So I think that's how I would address a little bit, but obviously would need more time to um, articulate. I think that your question was very important. So maybe if you can write it to us, then we can address it async as well. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much for the questions. Do share more questions. We'll kind of try and kind of curate this, collate this, and maybe open it up on our social media, and also ask for other thoughts and suggestions from all of you in terms of how to address some of these. There's so much rich discussion here in this group itself. So thank you so much, Shivangi, for joining us on this conversation today. It's been great. It's rare that we have the privilege really to speak to somebody like you, who's kind of had their own journey and has been then able to influence and inform policies and practices in different places. So that's a huge win for us to have you on the panel today. We look forward to. We'll send you some of these questions if you're open to answering this. And maybe there is Deepali and some of the others. There are some of these resource directories already available as well. Maybe we'll also send you linkages to those resource directories which are doing some of this work already and need possibly a little bit more dissemination around this. But we will try and curate some of these responses. And thanks once again to everyone who's joined us for Circle Back. We'll be back next month again with one of these sessions. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.